Right, so good evening everyone and welcome to the Foundry and Google headquarters in Dublin. My name is David McCabe and I'm the International Whisky Ambassador for Irish Distillers based in Dublin, or in Midleton rather. So we're delighted to share a kind of a unique experience with you this evening in celebration of World Whisky Day. So tonight we're going to explore the world of single pot still Irish whiskies, which are all produced at Midleton. And, you know, no better company to have than the five masters of the distillery. So it's something that it's a first for us because we never had the five masters on stage together at the one time. So if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together and welcoming you on stage, the five masters. So we'll start off with David Quinn, Master of Whisky Science. So following on, we have Brian Nation, Master Distiller. We then have Kevin O'Gorman, Master of Maturation. We have Billy Lighton, Master Blender. And last but not least, we have Ger Buckley, Master Cooper. Right, so over the next kind of hour or so, we're going to speak with each of you guys all about single pot still Irish whiskies in terms of the craft, the heritage, tradition and production of all the single pot still whiskies that we produce in Midleton. And we'll try and unearth everything that there is to know. So kind of to start things off, I might chat to you guys here, Brian and Dave. So single pot still Irish whiskey as a category was probably one of the most famous, if not the most well-known whiskey in the world at one stage. And I'd just like to kind of, I suppose, delve into a little more kind of knowledge on the history of single pot still Irish whiskey. Brian.
Hi, Dave. Yeah, I suppose it's fair to say that single pot still Irish whiskey was the biggest selling whiskey category worldwide in the mid-19th century. And then a number of circumstances or events occurred, some of which were inside our control, others which were outside of our control, like prohibition, for instance, that actually led to the demise of single pot still Irish whiskey. So much so that by 1960s, you actually ended up where the demise of single pot still Irish whiskey, but also the growth of Scotch whiskey, and so much so that actually Scotch became synonymous with whiskey, so that people, instead of going into a bar looking for a whiskey, they actually looked for a Scotch. And that really brings us up to the mid-60s.
And then when you look at, like, from the 60s to where we are now, how did kind of Irish whiskey as a style kind of survived, and kind of where are we now, Dave?
Yeah, well, I suppose there was a seminal moment back in 1966 when the three main families, whiskey-producing families at that time, who were the Jamiesons, the Powers in Dublin, and the Murphys in Cork, who had the Cork Distillers Company, decided to come together and form, what we know today as Irish Distillers. And they came together essentially to save the industry. We were that close to coming to a close, really. And that really started the ball in motion. We built a new distillery down in Midleton that was a bit more modern than the distilleries that they had in Dublin at the time. And around that time as well, in the mid-70s, you had Bushmills came on board, and really that was the way up until about 1987, when Cooley Distillery opened in County Louth. And really, from then up until fairly recently, we've started to see, and particularly in the last 20 years, a major resurgence in interest in Irish whiskey and in Irish pot still whiskey in particular. And so much so that in the last number of years, we've started to see new distilleries being built in the country. And, this is a situation that, has been such a long time coming. And
do we see it as a good thing, this
absolutely
emergence of whiskey distilleries?
Absolutely. I mean, in the last number of years, you've seen a distillery producing whiskey in Dingle, also in Tullamore, in Belfast. There's distilleries being built in Carlow and other places around the country, and some at the planning stage. And so much so that we see maybe at least 15, if not more, new distilleries coming on track. In fact, last week we had the launch of the vision for Irish whiskey, and we had all of the current players at that. And to think that from now up to, say, 2020, we're seeing a doubling in sales, a doubling in distillery numbers, or more than that, and a doubling again by 2030, which would bring us from a current market share of about 4%, which is obviously lots of room for improvement, up to about 12%. And that, would certainly make us a major player in the global whisky market.
And surely with these distilleries, some will be producing single pot still whisky, some with single malts and blends. So Brian, could you be able to give us just a brief overview of what is single pot still as a category and what makes it unique to Ireland?
Yeah, single pot still Irish whiskey is really the quintessential whiskey style for Ireland. And, we're lucky that it's still around today, and it's really because of the foresights of the likes of Barry Crockett, my predecessor, and in fact all of our predecessors, that back in the 80s they had the foresight to lay down stocks of single pot still whiskey so that we can produce the brands of single pot still that we have today. It's actually made from a mash bill of malted barley and unmalted barley. The malted barley that we use is unpeated, so there's no smoky taste off any of our whiskies. And then the unmalted barley imparts a creamy mouthfeel on all of our whiskies. And essentially what we're doing in the brewing process is we're trying to extract the starch from these grains, convert them into fermentable sugars, and then take those fermentable sugars forward to the fermentation to produce a range of alcohol and flavours. And then we come to the distillation process where we put it through a triple distillation process in copper pot stills. And essentially how that works is that the first pot still is really used to remove all alcohol and flavour from that fermented wash. So we're not really discriminating against the types of flavours that we want in our final distillate or new make spirit at this stage. But when we move forward to our second stage of distillation in the faint still, we actually take what's called a heads cut, a centre cut and a tails cut. It's only the centre cut from the faint still that goes forward to the final distillation known in the spirit still. And here we do exactly the same thing. We take a heads cut, a centre cut and a tails cut. And it's really the heart of the distillate here is the centre cut, which basically goes on for maturation. But that allows us to bring to the fore the spicy characteristics and the fruitiness that we associate with our distillates.
And then when you look at Irish whiskey generally, it's often considered Irish whiskey is triple distilled versus, say, double distilled in other distilleries in other countries. What difference does the triple distillation do on a spirit?
Yeah, it's that's a question that we get asked quite a lot. What does the third distillation actually do in terms of the character and flavour of the whiskey? And it's a key part of making pot still Irish whiskey, as well as what Brian mentioned, the unmalted barley in the mash, as well as the non-peated malt, and we'll hear about the wood in a minute and the contribution that makes. But that third distillation, and if you take a centre cut and take a centre cut of that, sometimes you get asked, aren't you running the risk maybe of losing some flavour? And but the way we do it and the way it's done when Brian takes his cutting strengths, if you take at the third distillation, you're removing more of the fusel oils, fusel alcohols, or the higher alcohols, which tend to be the components in a whiskey spirit that would be responsible essentially for heaviness in the whiskey. So you don't want to lose all of that, but you want to keep some of it for body in the whiskey. But by taking out more than what you would have, say, in a double distilled spirit, it allows some of the other features and characters in the whiskey, principally those that come at the more volatile end, like some of the esters and some of the aldehydes, that will impart more of those characteristic features that we associate with our whiskey, and that would be spiciness, little floral character and fruitiness that come through in the whiskey, and that's balanced by the remaining body left in the whiskey.
Okay.
And that's in essence what makes triple distilled Irish pot still whiskey unique, or certainly one of the major features of why it makes it unique.
Now, we got a question in from one of our Stillhouse members from the singlepotstill.com site. David Taylor, who's based in Tasmania, has a question for you, Dave. Where do you see single pot still Irish whiskies in the next 50 years?
50 years.
50.
If I'm still around.
Crystal ball.
Well, certainly I would expect to see it to re-establish itself as one of the main whisky categories within the global whisky world. And what I would really like and hope to see is that we will see a wide range of different types of pot still whiskies that each have their own character and flavour, all of them being top class whiskey, and hopefully coming from a range of distilleries located all around the island of Ireland. And if we had that, we would have a truly global whiskey and exactly a truly global presence. Right. Yeah.
We do have time for one or two questions from any members of the audience. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Dave or Brian regarding production or history, please don't be afraid to ask. Anyone at all? One here in the middle, down the front.
How you doing? Son?
Is the mic on, guys?
Yeah. Can you see anybody else around the world, like the Japanese or the Chinese or anything like that? Hello? Yeah.
We'll repeat the question. Okay.
Keep it quiet, yes? Hard thing. Can you see the style, pot still, Irish whiskey style, being copied by other countries?
So the question is, can we see the style of single pot still Irish whiskey being replicated in other, I suppose, whiskey distilling countries around the world?
I'm sure that approach will happen. I suppose replica or mimicry is the best compliment, I suppose you can say. But if we take other countries, for example, who are making whiskey at the moment that may have taken their guide from Scotland, for example, and making single malt whiskey, it doesn't mean that it's exactly the same as single malt Scotch, for example. And each of those other countries, like Japan, like Taiwan, like Sweden, like Spain, are making their own styles of whiskey, maybe based on known whiskey making processes. So if somebody decides to make a style of pot still whiskey elsewhere in the world, great, I wouldn't have a problem with that. It won't be Irish pot still whiskey, but it'll be a style of pot still whiskey that I'm sure will reflect whiskey making in that particular country.
Is there any other questions? Another gentleman here in the middle.
It's not about whiskey, it's related though, because there's a master cooper on stage. Just wondering what the state of coopering in Ireland is. Are people still making barrels, and are coopers still training up? Are there people learning how to be a cooper?
Well, at the moment we have an apprentice. We have an apprentice for the last 2 years. There's an apprentice in Bushman's distillery. The numbers have depleted vastly over 100 years, from about 8,000 or 9,000 down to 4.
4,000.
So you can see how valuable I am.
Is that a pay rise request here? Is it?
But yeah, it is. We are training up an apprentice, and there'll be more to follow. And with the growth, especially in pot still whiskies, there will be a need for coopers in the future. So that's why you see the display of tools here. So thankfully, I can say I'm not the last. There's more to follow behind me. So the future's looking good for coopering.
And in 50 years, where do you see it?
I see a large cooperage in Midleton.
So thanks for that, Dave and Brian. So as we all know, for it to be called whiskey, it needs to be aged for a number of years in wooden casks. So to learn more about, the reactions that oak has on spirit, there's no better two experts here to talk to than Kevin O'Gorman, Master of Maturation, and Billy Lighton, Master Blender. So Billy, I might ask you, what are the, predominant types of casks we'd use in Midleton, and what kind of flavours would you expect to derive from those barrels?
Yeah, well, I suppose, first of all, the vast majority, with very little exception, of the casks that we buy in are already seasoned. They're pre-seasoned. When I talk about seasoning, it means that they will have held something else before we put whiskey into them. And out of those, the majority will come from America. So they're coming out of the bourbon business. So whenever we fill a new bourbon cask, that's a B1, that's a first fill. It's already had bourbon. We fill it once with whiskey, and the flavours we would expect to get from a first fill bourbon cask would be, it would have a connection to bourbon. You'll get strong vanilla spiciness, so sweet to that extent. You will also get some charred oak effect. All bourbon barrels are heavily charred on the inside, and that carries over into the whiskey. And I feel as blender that charred oak effect is quite complementary to the spicy nature of the pot still distillate. We also use a lot of sherry casks. Those casks have been seasoned for 2 years with Oloroso sherry, typically, and that sherry seasoning then will deliver quite a lot of fruity notes, dried fruit, raisins, sultanas, figs, prunes, that type of character, along with maybe a little bit of a nutty note as well, like walnuts, almonds. And then, of course, those casks are used 3 times, so each cycle delivers a little bit of a variation on flavour. We would also take in some casks from Portugal. We have Madeira, Malaga, Marsala, all casks that were traditionally used for whiskey maturation.
And then when these casks do come in, obviously quality control will be of paramount importance. So in terms of inspection, Kevin, kind of what checks are involved when you get these casks in from all over the world?
Yeah, in terms of quality control, I suppose Billy alluded to it there. I would say one of the most important things is the relationships we've built up with cooperages and sawmills around the world over the last, 30, 40 years. We deal with 3 cooperages in America, Kelvin, Barrels Unlimited and Bluegrass. And we've been working with those guys for well over 30 years. So we have a very long relationship. We have a high specification for our barrels. They understand what we want, and it was really, really important, that relationship in terms of quality. Likewise with Spain, we source a lot of sherry butts, as Billy has said, from Jerez. We trace the wood back to the forest in Galicia. We have close links with the sawmills, and a very close link with Antonio Paez, again going back over probably 30 years. So that's probably the first most important step in terms of quality. Secondly, in sort of more production technical, would be we've 100% inspection when they arrive at Midleton. So for example, all the American barrels, we have 100% inspection. All the sherry butts, external inspection, and every sherry butt is actually nosed when it arrives at Midleton. And they arrive between November and March every year. So that's the next stage really in terms of quality control. And I suppose finally then is the care we take with our barrels in warehouse. All our barrels are stored indoors. That might sound like an obvious thing, but that's really, really important from the quality of the cask. And likewise, our empty casks, we take as much care of our empty casks as our full casks. They're all stored indoors as well. And the only casks you'd see outdoors in Midleton are ones that we're selling off or disposing of. So, that gives you a flavour of all the, important steps in the quality control of the cask.
And then when it comes to using casks made from oak, you're looking at trees that could be 80 years, 100 years, even 140 years old. Is, oak sustainability an issue, or is it a factor to take into consideration?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work over the last number of years on oak sustainability in America, Portugal, Spain, and indeed Ireland. So the picture in America, Portugal and Spain is quite good. A key factor there is the incremental growth of oak. In other words, how much oak is being taken out and how much the actual volume of oak is growing by. And the factors in America, Portugal and Spain are quite good. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of good forest management practices, etc. But the picture is good. In terms of Ireland, I suppose that we have a particular project which we started 7 or 8 years ago. And by pure coincidence, I have a bottle here. And before I start, there's not one for everyone in the audience. Okay, so just calm down slightly. So maybe just to touch on this in terms of sustainability and quality. As I say, we started this about 7 or 8 years ago. 2 key components from the very start were, first of all, the sustainability of Irish oak. We had to ensure that we had a sustainable supply. And secondly was the quality of the oak. And the wood compounds that we get from the oak. So we sort of involved a lot of people in this project. We've a forestry consultant, Paddy Purser, who really helped on the sustainability side. And really the picture on Irish oak is very, very good. A lot of planting in the last number of years. And it's only now that really we can start working on Irish oak. In terms of the flavour, tremendous flavour from the Irish oak. We're really pleased with it. It's fast growing. It's lower density. It's higher porosity. And we get really good contribution in terms of maturation. So we're very, very happy with it. So a tremendous collaboration. It's 58%. It's cask strength. The whiskies were between 15 and 22 years old that went into the Irish oak casks, and we left them there for 10 months. And we're really delighted with the outcome.
We actually even have a video now just to highlight the Midleton Darg Gaelic as well that we might play there as well.
The first Irish whisky in recent history to be matured in homegrown virgin Irish oak, Darg Gaelic is one of a kind. It's as individual as it is irresistible, as satisfyingly Irish as it is undeniably elegant. It's a whisky like no other. It's often said that a good beginning makes a good ending, and where better to begin the story of Darg Gaelic than in the company of Paddy Purser, a man who knows a thing or two about forest management, harvesting, and regeneration. It was Paddy we turned to help us find the perfect Irish oak for our hogshead barrels. The wood had to be from a sustainable source, and of course, it had to be suitable for maturing whisky. Eventually, our quest for perfection led us to the beautiful Ballatobin estate near Callan in County Kilkenny. The 114-acre wood on the estate were first mapped in 1655, and since then, generation after generation of the Gabbett family have been looking after them, tending to each plant, from seedling to sapling to fully grown tree. And it was here, in the ancient Grinsell woods, that we found the Irish oak we were looking for. A remarkable 130 years old and hand-picked as part of the Gabbett's carefully managed regeneration program. Just 10 trees were felled on the 10th and 11th of April 2012. Once gathered in, the oak, Quercus robur, was shipped to the Spanish region of Galicia and to the Madabar sawmills. Here, the barrel's staves are quarter sawn. "15 months later, the oak from Ballatobin is ready to be worked by the bodega's coopers. Using tried and trusted hand tools and skills perfected over time, they bring stave, hoop and head together to create 48 once-in-a-lifetime hogshead casks. The finishing touch is to medium toast the casks, and together with the wood's natural virtues adds a subtle fragrance, a unique warmth and vanilla sweetness to the final blend. At last the casks are ready for the long journey back to Ireland, where they're filled with a range of 15 to 22-year-old pot distillates. each distillate is carefully chosen as the perfect complement for the Irish oak flavours. After 10 months, Dargaelic was judged to be beautifully balanced, subtly yet unmistakably flavoured, with hints of chocolate and caramel, and with toasted notes. In short, as perfect as the Irish oak that gives it its name.
Right, and just one final question before we move on. We have a member of the Redbreast Facebook page, Aberlour Laddie, who has a question to you, Billy. I know. His question is, will we ever see a single cask release under the Redbreast or Spot range?
We do single casks, okay, and single casks by their nature are single casks, where Redbreast, for example, is a mix of casks. It's a balance of casks, both bourbon casks and sherry casks. So we have done and will continue to do single cask offerings to people like travel retail, for example, and a few customers like Celtic Whisky Shop in Dublin, the Whisky Exchange. Now they would be kind of specific types of cask, mostly ex-bourbon casks at various ages. Would we do something like Redbreast? Well, we could do something like focus in on a component of Redbreast, say the sherry component, for example, and maybe choose a cask, a sherry cask that would be representative of the sherry component in Redbreast, or equally like Yellow Spot, where the feature cask is the Malaga cask. Possibly we could do a single Malaga cask. So I suppose the answer to the question is anything's possible in the future.
Watch this space.
Watch this space, exactly, yeah.
So, Ger Buckley, our master cooper, you come from a family steeped in tradition of coopering. Would you mind telling us a bit more about your road distillery and a few of your tools?
I will, Dave. I brought some tools with me and to try and share with everybody. And in my family, we've been coopers for 5 generations now, as you said, well over 200 years. And the beauty about that is everything I do in regards to repairing a barrel or fixing a cask hasn't changed. Hasn't changed for decades, hasn't changed for hundreds of years. And a lot of the tools I have haven't changed in that time either. So it's quite unique to say that I'm probably still working with my grandfather's tools, earning a living. And some of the selection of tools that I brought, and the first one that I kind of show people, and people can get a shock when they see it first, but it's a Cooper's axe, Cooper's broad axe. Wasn't fighting the distillers or anything we were, but so it's only beveled on one side, so it's quite specific. Like up to 200 years ago, if you were to prepare any wood, you could only do it with axes. You couldn't do it with saws; they hadn't been developed. And some of the photographs you see of me and thing is working on a stave, listing it. That's trimming it. That's carving it, making it wide in the middle, getting thinner as I go down the stave. So if I was to turn this axe sideways and work it towards myself, I create another tool that's very common nowadays, or has been for centuries, is an adze. So it's a very useful tool. It's very, it gives you lots of flexibility in what you want to try and achieve, what you want to do. If you were, say, North American Indians working in stone or flint, you could have an adze to carve out a canoe. Same in the Pacific Rim. If you're trying to carve out a canoe to get to Easter Island, you have big stone adzes that help you do that. Same tools developed in Japan, China, in Europe. So they've been very specific in that way. And the other 2 tools that I have here on the barrel is a Cooper's hammer, which is quite heavy, about 4 pounds, and what I call a driver. And this drives down the hoop. You've got to hold it in a special way so that if you do miss, it'll only go down the side of the cask. If you hold it like that and miss, you're going to lose your fingers fairly quick. So that when you work on the cask, driving down the hoops. So between these three tools, they're going back in history almost 90,000 years in stone or flint. So it's quite unique to know that I have a link with somebody 50 or 100 or 90,000 years ago and still using them. So some of the other tools that I have, especially in coopering, kind of have lovely names in that they're named after animals. It's going to happen here in Ireland, happen in parts of England. The first tool that I have, it's a kind of a lever, and it helps me that when I'm putting a rush or a reed in the top of the cask, which is the only material I have to help me seal it. We don't use glues or silicones or anything like that. So if I have the hoops off and I pull the stave back to get at the inside so I can get the rush in. And we call this tool a dog, basically because it's got 2 ears on it. If you're in carpentry or you're in engineering even and you want to grab something or hold something to a bench, you use dogs to hold it. So I like to think that this is the original dog that started the whole trend. So another tool that again is named after an animal, it's a type of spoke shave, and I would use it to flatten the head or work down the side of the cask. We call it a swift, basically because it's got 2 wings on it. So other tools such as a horse or a crow's, and this is a cutting tool that cuts the groove on the top of the barrel for the lid or the head to fit into. So unless you make that groove, you can't make a barrel. So I have to have this tool to make a cask. It's got 2 cutters here that sit in the barrel and you work around it. Again, it's quite ancient. It's been reversed, so it's well worn on this side, and I'm working away on the other side. I'm not sure how many decades this goes back. And 2 other very special tools I have here. This is the only measuring tool that a cooper would have, a compass. These are kind of unique to Ireland as such in that they're timber compasses instead of dividers. And we would make these ourselves. So you use it to go around the edge of the cask 6 times. That gives you your circumference. So you have different sizes for different casks. To make this tool, I have somebody here that I'm not sure again how many generations it's gone back. To carve that thread on the inside of the compass, somebody in my family at some stage got a bolt and hand filed the threads on the bolt, so then you could cut into the compass. So you basically have to make a tool so that you can make a compass, so you can make a tool. So as I said, there are some of the things you must do as a cooper, be able to make your own tools and use them. And last but not least, every cooper had to stand over his work. You couldn't just make a load of barrels, throw them out and hope they hold whiskey. They better hold whiskey because they're going to be in there for 15, 20 years. So you pre-marked your work with a block mark. So a cooper would always work at a block of wood. And for me, my mark that I would put on every cask that was handed down to me from my father, of course, is number 1. I'm sure it was my father's, or my grandfather's decision. But you can see how well worn that is even. And that's just from hitting on timber. So it takes decades to wear it down. So there are a sample of some of the tools. And like what I always say, that if you don't have a barrel, if you don't have a cask, you don't have any whiskey. So you've got to have a cooper to make the barrel and repair the barrel. So I'll hand you back to Dave.
I have a feeling that last statement might be a bone of contention for other of the masters here. But is there any questions for any members of the audience before we move on? Gentleman in the middle.
Hi, just back to the Irish oak. Out of curiosity, as a style of oak, what do you find you get, or what flavours do you find yourselves getting that you wouldn't get out of, say, like American oak, or and this is a 2-part question. The second part is, how do you find those flavours complementing, say, the signature calling cards of single pot still as a style? So like the texture and the spice and everything you were talking about.
I can take that.
Yeah,
I'll take the first part of it. Dark Whalelock, we obviously did a lot of research back at the start of this in terms of the wood itself. So it's Quercus robur. So it's in America you have Quercus alba typically, Quercus robur in Spain, and Quercus robur in Ireland. Now there is other species as well, but our first batch was Quercus robur. So as I said earlier on, it grows faster in Ireland because of the growing season, because of the moisture. So American oak would be more dense, Irish oak less dense, more porous, so you have a more open structure. So that's probably an indication of what's going to happen in terms of maturation. We also did a lot of analysis in terms of the wood compounds. So we found the Irish oak particularly strong in certain compounds. For example, vanillin, vanillic acid, furfural. And these compounds tend to give a lot of sort of caramel, toffee, chocolate, milk chocolate flavours. So when you taste Dargwelloch, if you haven't tasted it already, it's really very much pronounced. Those beautiful, creamy chocolate, toffee flavours is stunning. So that's sort of the direction it was heading in, and that's quite different and distinct from the Spanish oak, for example, or the American oak. So does that answer the...
Yeah, and then the only other question I had was, how do you find, so say that coffee complements what you're saying, the spice and the creaminess of pastilles and style? Do they gel well?
Absolutely. I mean, we're absolutely delighted with the output of Midleton Dargwelloch. When we put it into the Hogshead Irish oak, we had to keep a close eye on it because we knew there was going to be, fairly fast maturation. It was virgin Irish oak. So Billy and I kept a close eye on it every month. We sampled it. That's a fact. For 10 months. So we had great fun, Billy and me. It was, and you see, it was like
That's what you guys call quality control. Euphemism.
That's exactly quality control. But it was like a sort of a child or a baby progressing, and it was a rapid progression. And we were very happy after 10 months, and we said, you know what, that is the perfect balance. We still have the spices in the pot still. We had the flavours we were looking from the Irish oak, and the whole thing just came together. And to be honest, we're really happy with it.
I think Midleton Dargwelloch really does hit home the amount of innovation that goes on at Midleton Distillery, and it's something that we pride ourselves upon, and not just on wood but also on developing new distillate styles. And there's one word that's very important for us up there, and it's single, because that single means single distillery, and that's so important for us because it means that we're in control of quality from grain to glass. So we have to be able to be innovative. We have to develop new styles of distillates. We work with different woods in order to make sure we can produce the array of single pot stills Irish whiskey that we have today.
So I suppose speaking about the different styles of spirits and casks, might be a good time to actually go through some of the pot still range that we have in front of us today. So Billy, would you mind going through some notes about Redbreast 12 for us?
I don't mind at all, Dave. Redbreast 12-year-old, there you have it, Redbreast 12. There's an age statement on this. That means that the youngest whiskey in there is 12 years old. It doesn't mean it's all 12 years old, because for me as blender to get the balance right, we take a wider age range. So we only use first fill casks, both bourbon and sherry. And because we've got a high level of bourbon, a lot of that bourbon influence in the bourbon component, then we have to try and match that with the sherry. So there's quite a substantial portion of sherry in there. So just taking a quick nose. You know, the sherry fruitiness, those dried fruits, a little bit of nuttiness is very obvious. Now, the Redbreast 12, I mean, it can be very much enjoyed neat. I like to just add a few drops of water because that opens up the flavours, the aromas for me. So, and I'm really, really interested in that as the blender, because I know what the profile should be like. So, and those again, you get, I think first of all, what you get is some of that delicate vanilla sweetness, but it very quickly opens up to the very round, mellow, dried fruit character, and even at the very end, you get some of that nuttiness, like walnuts or almonds at the very end. So now just with a little taste. I think the first thing to say is what's already been mentioned is that smooth, silky mouthfeel that you get. And that's coming from, as Brian has said, the use of the unmalted barley in the mash bill. But also, there's a lot of, it really gives a big mouthful very quickly. It gives you a big mouthful of that fruity, dried fruit. I say the raisins, sultanas, even some figs, prunes, that type of fleshy, dark fruit, and then it finishes off going back to the lighter, delicate, spicy character of the pot still distillate.
Very good. And Kevin, would you mind taking us through maybe about the history and the flavour profile of Green Spot, please?
Yeah, I will indeed. It was a form of torture there watching Billy tasting whiskey. It was very, very, very difficult.
How do you think I feel? I've no glass.
So yeah, Green Spot. Just a small bit of history, I suppose. We'd have to mention the Mitchell family when we're talking about Green Spot. The Mitchell family, they opened up a shop in Grafton Street. It was William Mitchell back in 1805. It was a confectionery shop. And then I suppose the next significant date for the Mitchells was 1887, when Robert Mitchell, and in fact the seventh generation, Robert now is looking after the business. But Robert Mitchell set up really as a bonder in Kildare Street. And as a bonder, they used to import wine casks and fortified wine casks from around the world. Spain, Portugal, and particularly sherry, Oloroso sherry, and Fino sherry from Jerez. So they had these casks, so they used to purchase distillate from the various distillers, including John Jameson, and they used to mature it in their cellars. The other thing then they were quite famous for was this daub of paint, which would indicate the age. For example, Green Spot, 10 years, Yellow Spot, which we relaunched a number of years ago, 12 years. So that was interesting, and actually to this day our sherry butt filling arrangement in Midleton, we still use a daub of paint. So some things never change, I suppose. So we still use a daub of paint, yeah. So the Green Spot is bottled at 40%. So can't wait for this. We'll have a taste. So we use two different types of casks in the makeup of Green Spot. We use sherry butts, as we spoke about earlier on, from Antonio Paya's season for 2 years with Oloroso sherry. And we also use American bourbon barrels. So they go into the makeup of Green Spot. It's aged 7 to 10 years, and there's a particular distillate style in Green Spot which gives a nice element of sweetness to the final whiskey. So just on the nose, for me, Green Spot initially is very like orchard fruits, very sort of like ripe red apple hits me on the nose. I also get sort of aromatic oils, which is very, very distinct, and a little bit of toasted wood as well in the background, and the whole thing is just nicely in balance. So I can have a taste now. There you go.
And don't worry, everyone here in the audience, you'll be doing a tasting afterwards as well.
So really on the taste, to me it's a lovely balance, and there's a nice bit of sweetness initially, and the Green Spot is on sort of the sweeter side of our tasting wheel. Lovely element of sweetness that begins to fade in, and I get sort of nice bit of fruit and toasted wood, and then the spices typical of the single pot still coming through as well. The whole thing is just working in harmony, and again a nice to taste lingers. It goes on, and it's really delightful. Okay, so Green Spot.
Dave, Powers John's Lane.
Yeah. I suppose we should, well, what I'd say first is that Powers, as many of you will know, was one of the original distilling families here in Dublin. And Powers were well recognised and well renowned for producing a good full-bodied whiskey, whiskey that was primarily distillate-driven rather than cask-driven, so that the flavours and character in the whiskey was related more to the distillate coming off the still rather than the wood. And so what we decided to do with this particular whiskey was to try and put a whiskey together that sort of brought us back a little bit to what whiskey may have been like some time ago, and sort of delved back into a more full-bodied and characterful whiskey. And that's why we call this one Powers John's Lane, because John's Lane was the address in Dublin where the old Powers distillery was originally located. So that's what we did. That distillery closed back in 1976, and so it's a salute really to that distillery that was in operation from 1790 right up until 1976. And what you get if when you nose it, you get that initial full-bodied flavour of you get characters. It's like leather and pipe tobacco with hints of dark chocolate and vanilla, and all of those seem to be sort of meshed together in a blanket of sort of charred wood that holds it all together. And if we take a little taste, again, that creamy texture on the palate, that mouthfeel, that's synonymous with pot still whiskey. But what you get that almost like a sort of a mini explosion of spice. It's a little bit of hints of clove there, but also dried fruit like dried apricot and honey there in the background. So it's really a whiskey that has huge complexity, but great balance and great drinkability at the same time. It's the style of whiskey that you kind of would drink, say, in a snifter glass or in a balloon glass, and allow it warm in your hand, and allow those volatile flavours to warm up and release out of the whiskey. So if a style of whiskey that you like is more on the full-bodied side with lots of character and huge complexity, then Powers John's Lane won't disappoint.
And then, last but not least, Brian, would you mind telling us a bit about Midleton Barry Crockett Legacy?
No problem. Midleton Barry Crockett Legacy was released in 2010, and it was released really to celebrate the illustrious career of my predecessor, Barry Crockett. Barry was master distiller at Midleton Distillery for almost 40 years, and his father was master distiller before him. And I suppose I was in the very fortunate position to train under Barry for over 10 years. Now, some people say I was a slow learner, but basically, I can assure you there was a lot to learn. And what was done with Midleton Barry Crockett Legacy was really to try and showcase the different distillate styles that Barry was involved in producing during his career. So Midleton Barry Crockett Legacy has 3 types of pot distillate used in it, and they're all matured along with the Midleton style in American oak barrels. And some of them have been seasoned with bourbon, and in fact, one particular style of distillate is actually seasoned in unseasoned American oak barrels. So the result is really giving a whiskey with a lot of complexity, highlighting a lot of the distillate characteristic, but also showcasing the contribution from American oak. So if we taste, again, sorry now lads, you haven't got to taste it yourselves yet, but I'll tell you about it. So for me on the nose, immediately what you're getting is those pot still spices coming through. And those pot still spices here for Midleton Barry Crockett Legacy are really, sweet green pepper. There's hints of garden mint. There's even citrus fruits coming through. For me, it's almost like lime flavour coming through as well. And, then you're getting that vanilla sweetness and toasted wood coming from the actual American oak. And on the taste, the exceptional smoothness coming from the triple distillation process, that creaminess coming from the use of unmalted barley, and those flavours from the nose following all the way through, and the taste really work very well to have that complexity of those lime fruits coming through, or those citrus fruits coming through, and that vanilla sweetness and that green pepper spices. And while I'm talking, the finish is long and lingering and pleasant, and it's bringing you through a full array of, starting from maturation flavours, back to distillate flavours, and almost back to barley from where it all began. So it really is a very fitting tribute to Barry Crockett, as I said, who was my mentor, and I'm very proud to have been mentored by.
I suppose what's interesting there as well, Brian, which you alluded to earlier, is that even though they all have their own individual styles and personalities, it's all from the one single distillery, which is kind of an important fact.
And I think that we really can't underestimate for us the importance of the single distillery, what it means to us, because it does mean that we can control the quality from grain to glass. And it also keeps us on our toes from an innovation and new product development point of view as well.
Brilliant. Now, there's a lot of viewers at home watching it online, and we have a few friends that we're going to talk to from around the world. So we're first going to talk to Mark Gillespie, who is the executive producer of whiskycast.com. So are you there, Mark?
I'm here, guys. Good to see all of you.
How are you doing?
And my first question is how Gary gets all those tools through airport security.
Could be persuasive with an axe.
So, Mark, do you have a question for one of the masters?
Yeah, let's talk to Brian for a second about this and sort of amplify on what you're saying about being able to take the single stills at Midleton and the single distillery. I think when I was there a few years ago, Dave compared it to playing the stills like an organ. How do you juggle the different types of stills, the different types of grain recipes to create whiskeys that have such different flavors as the Redbreasts, the Powers Johnson, Green Spot, and Yellow Spot? How do you juggle all of those to come up with different recipes using the same set of stills?
Hi, Mark. Good question. We pride ourselves at Midleton from the being a single distillery point of view and being able to produce these range of single pot stills. And one of the key things for us is having the flexibility and versatility associated with the distillery. And we achieve the different styles of pot distillates firstly by we can change our mash bill, which is ultimately changing the proportion of malted barley to unmalted barley. And then moving forward into the distillation process, adjusting our cuts from centre to tails during the second distillation and third distillation to ultimately produce an array of different styles of distillates. And if you bring it down to essentially brass taxes and do a comparison between something like a Redbreast and something like Green Spot, the particular style of distillate that goes into Redbreast would be more full-bodied and robust spices coming through with hints of heavier style fruits. And then if you compare that to Green Spot, where we're looking for more lighter spices and sweeter spices coming through, and we are really achieving those from the different cuts from centre to tails in the second and third distillations. And then if you take those array of distillate styles and bring them forward to maturation and mature these styles in a number of different casks, these themselves give you different resultant whiskies to play around with and styles of whiskey to play around with. So all in all, there's a great flexibility between the brewing, distillation and maturation program to allow us to present these styles of single pot still whiskies here today.
Good question, and thanks for that, Mark. So we have another question.
10 years.
All the best. And we have another question now coming in from Richard Thomas, who is the owner and managing director of the Whiskey Reviewer. Are you there, Richard? Hello?
Yes, I am.
How are you doing?
I'm sunny in Portugal.
Happy days, enjoying the weather. So, Richard, do you have a question for one of the masters today?
Yes, I have a question for Kevin. You detailed the kinds of wood that you use at Midleton for maturing your whiskey quite thoroughly, but in terms of your single pot still style, what do you think is the best mate in terms of wood choices for that kind of whiskey?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, well, as you know, we've a wide variety of casks that we use at Midleton Distillery. We mentioned earlier on about sherry butts, pour pipes, even Irish oak as well. So each of those give a different flavour profile. There's two factors. One is the particular oak species itself, be it Quercus robur or Quercus alba, and the second factor is what is seasoned in the cask. So, for example, is it Oloroso sherry? Is it Ruby port? Is it Malaga wine? And in fact, a significant contribution comes from the actual oak itself, the oak species. So they all come together to give a different flavour profile. And then we fill those with different single pot still distillates to give us a huge amount of permutations of different flavours. So there's no specific one works better with the other. We try all different combinations, and it's great because we have so many different permutations. Even if you look at the Midleton Dark Whalelock as an example, for the first 15 to 22 years, it spent its life in a refill American cask. And then for 10 months, it was finished in the Hogshead Irish Oak cask. So we knew that the Hogshead Irish Oak was going to give a significant contribution in terms of maturation. So that's why we use refill bourbon casks to start with. And so the whole idea was to get the whole thing in balance. So I hope that answers your question. Really, it gives us lots and lots of combinations, and there's no exact rules of what suits any particular distillate style.
Thanks for that, Richard. So is there anyone in the audience who has a few questions to ask any of our masters? Anyone at all? One over here.
I've got two questions, if I may. One is, why was the Irish oak exported to Spain to have casks made and not made here in Ireland? And the second question is, what happens to all the tops and tails that are used, or are they disposed of?
Yeah, well, in relation to your first question, really, we've a long-standing relationship with the guys in Spain. We needed some expertise in terms of quarter sawing. You can quarter saw at various sawmills in Ireland, but really in terms of coopering and getting the right quality, we really wanted to link in with the guys in Galicia. And really, once we brought the logs there, we could see immediately, it was a very good decision. There's no reason why maybe in the future that we can't look at sawmilling and quarter sawing in Ireland. We just need, I suppose, the expertise and the technology to do it, because it's quite a tricky operation, as you saw from the video. So that's really the reason we went to Spain. And in relation to the offcuts, for example, Michael Gabbett, who was the farmer we used for the first one, well, he used all the offcuts for firewood in his own farm. He's a lot of wood burners, so he used all the offcuts for that. So the whole tree was basically used.
The question was the tops and tails from the distillation process, not from...
Oh, sorry, that was the offcuts of trees. Sorry.
I'm trying to take it again.
Oh, sorry.
Brian, you want to answer that?
Yes, in the second and third distillations, what we do with the tops and tails is we actually recycle them back into the heads and tails from the second distillation are recycled back into the faint still with the next batch coming forward from the first distillation. And similarly, in the third distillation, in the spirit still, the heads and tails are recycled back into the spirit still with the centre cut coming forward from the faint still. And that's very important. It's a very, very important part of the distillation process because it allows you to have what we call a balanced distillation, and it allows you to produce a consistent flavour profile and quality every time. If you were not to recycle those heads and tails, what actually would happen is from an alcohol point of view, it would be inefficient anyway. But even from a flavour profile point of view, you would end up with getting different distillate flavour profiles at the end of each distillation. So the recycling forms is an intricate part of the process.
Very good.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Yep. We'll go over on the left side again this time.
Good evening. Lee Murray, Irish Whisky Society, Cork. Given I know it's the extension of the still house in Midleton, and I see that the 4 products that you have tasting and on display tonight are at the premium end of the expressions. Is there do you have a problem with, say, guaranteeing stocks to A, supply the top end whiskies, and B, to innovate as you go along? And is the object then to keep, say, your main expression as the Jameson label for export, for instance, and that would have priority over any innovation for the future? Thank you.
Right, who wants to take that one?
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
Well, to answer the last part of your question first, no, there's an awful lot of planning goes into our production across the range of brands. So Jameson gets its allocation, but for along the premiums, all the single pot still Irish whiskey range, they are planned for, and the stock is kind of set aside to supply the demand that has been forecast for across the range. But it's maybe easier said than done. For example, if we take Redbreast 12-year-old, there's a 12-year-old age statement on there that means that the youngest whiskey in that bottle is 12 years old, which means that we actually have to have made, today we have to have made the next 12 years worth of Redbreast 12-year-old. So there's a lot of planning involved. Now, for us to have Redbreast 12-year-old, there is an age range, as I mentioned earlier, and the 12-year-old goes up maybe between 12 and 14. So if we take the 14-year-old portion of that, there would be a sherry inclusion there. Now, it takes us up to 5 years to have a sherry cask made and ready for filling. By the time we go to the sawmills, get the staves air dried, and 2 years seasoning, up to 5 years. So we have to plan, like today, we'd have planned for the next 19 years. There'd be planning will have gone into the next 19 years supply of Redbreast 12-year-old. And then on top of that, Brian needs to know what he has to produce in the distillery in the way of the styles of distillate. Kevin needs to know what casks he needs to have on hand to fill the distillate into. Brian needs a forecast of 10 years. So in fact, the planning that goes into Redbreast 12-year-old, it's actually 29 years in the planning. So, there's a lot of thought, a lot of my time is spent on planning and managing the stocks. So, yeah, we're covered. There are no stock issues because it is all planned for.
Good. Any other questions? I take the gentleman here in the middle.
Hi. I was wondering, you've alluded an awful lot to bourbon casks and to sherry and a certain amount of Madeira and port pipes and so on. Is there any plans in the future, or any other barrels such as rum, cognac, so on, being used to mature any Irish whiskey? And is there any plans in the future for any other limited releases, such as the Manilov that was released earlier this year, the Redbreast? And my kind of main question is, are there any plans to bring back or to do another limited release of Jameson 15?
Well, let's just take it, first of all. We are not limited to the cask you mentioned, bourbon, sherry, Malaga. We, like everybody else, any other distillery will have trial casks stewing away in the background there. And, some of those work, some of them don't. And, It's something an area that myself as a blender, I keep my cards close to my chest as far as what could be coming down the road, because I know what's there. But we have some marketing people in the audience tonight who will have the last say.
Now, we did get another question in as well regarding kind of like Ireland with different regions in the country, and would that ever kind of lend itself to having styles of whiskey that would be kind of synonymous with a region, something like the way in Scotland you have different regions with whiskies that would have kind of certain flavour profiles from those areas. Do you ever see something like that happening in the future, Dave, perhaps?
It's possible. Certainly it doesn't exist at this point in time, and that's simply because of the small number of distilleries that we have available to us at this point in time. But there is a possibility that maybe into the future, as we get more and more distilleries coming on stream, that you might find that distilleries that may be up in sort of the northern part of the country, or the north-western part of the country, for example, because of the approach maybe that they take to making the whiskey, or maybe even the climatic conditions might be such that it might give rise to a particular style of whiskey. And that could well happen in the future. But I think for that to happen, you do need to build a scale of distillery numbers for any type of sort of style type of arrangement to evolve within the country, and that could well happen. But as things stand at the moment, I think we do have our own styles of, we have pot still whiskey, we also have malt whiskey, and of course we have grain whiskey, which is also a style of whiskey in its own right. And I think there's lots of possibilities that we can explore within the sort of, call it the three generic styles, before maybe we get to regional differences.
So it could be something in the future once there's more distilleries
possibly
in the country.
Yeah.
And I think before we finish up, I have one question myself, which is for all of you. But out of all the 5 masters, who is the most important master at the distillery?
How long do you have?
Now, bear in mind, Ger does have an axe nearby, so just be very careful.
Well, obviously,
I'll vote for Ger. He's obviously very important, and
this is it.
He gets paid more than the rest of us. So.
I deservedly so.
Right, so everyone, I think that kind of wraps up this evening's session. I hope you enjoyed it, our audience members who are here with us this evening, and then everyone that's watching it live at home. For those of you who would like to learn or know more about Single Pot Still Irish Whiskey, we do have a website, singlepotstill.com, where if you log on, you can be or join our Stillhouse kind of club, so to speak, and you get all the latest news, articles about single pot stills, how they're made, and the future products that might be coming out. And also, if any of you ever make the trip down to our distillery in Midleton and you want to get a bit more involved in seeing how it's made, we also have an Irish Whiskey Academy that we do classes from 1 day to 2 days to even 3. So if you ever like to come down and visit us, please do so. We'd love to show you around. And you can get more information on our website, irishwhiskeyacademy.com. So I think for myself and our 5 masters here this evening, it was a pleasure speaking with you and all our guests at home as well. So thank you very much, and take care.